Catherine Amirfar.
And I'm Cal Raustiala.
And this is International Law Behind the Headlines, coming to you from
the American Society of International Law.
Welcome, everyone. This is Cal Raustiala. I'm co-host of our podcast, International Law Behind the Headlines. And it's a great pleasure to welcome on the podcast Peter Singer. I've known Peter a long time. He is strategist and senior fellow at New America, but also someone with a very interesting background of books ranging from Children at War, Corporate Warriors, The Rise of the Privatized Military Industry, Wired for War, and most recently, LikeWar. So Peter is an expert on all aspects of armed conflict, but in particular has written, and we'll get into some of his really interesting work in this regard, spoken and thought about the future of warfare probably more than anyone else in the country. He's written a number of research-based novels as well, including Ghost Fleet and Burn-In. And so I've asked Peter to come on to talk about technology on the battlefield and the implications for international law in the coming years. So Peter, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you. I should also mention Peter is a professor at ASU, Arizona State University as well. And most recently is kind of co-founder of a company called Useful Fiction that produces research-based fiction. Maybe, Peter, we could just start with that. What do you do with Useful Fiction, and kind of explain it? I think that'll help situate why you're such an interesting guest for us.
Oh, thank you. And actually, we can link it back to our topic on the crosses between international law and conflict. So the starting point for Useful Fiction is my partner, August Cole, and I. He was a Wall Street Journal defense reporter. And about a decade back, we came to the realization that there were some major changes going on in global security that we felt weren't being paid enough attention to. They crossed from the focus on just terrorism, counterinsurgency, thinking that was not just the present, but going to be the future of global security, as well as missing certain technology trends. And we felt, you know what, actually, there's a bigger story going on, the rise of China and the emergence of that in terms of everything from the economic to the national security implications. And looking not to the future, but also at history, we thought, you know what, great powers, when they rise, they tend to come into certainly competition. Most often, they also come into conflict. And that there is a risk that global security is not just going to be about the ISISes of the world, but it's going to be about this renewed superpower competition and maybe even conflict, but that it would be different than how it was envisioned back in the Cold War because of new technology issues like cybersecurity, information warfare, supply chain vulnerabilities, et cetera. Now, a lot of this seems, total top of mind right now, but again, where we were 10 years back, it was not. And it was both the case in national security circles. If you read, everything from the international law journals to the U.S. defense strategy, but it was also the same in the fiction world. The Tom Clancy stories had gone terrorism. And so we decided the best way to explain and share that nonfiction message was not with another nonfiction book or white paper or journal article, but rather what we did is we created the concept that we call useful fiction. And it's the bringing together of nonfiction research, but wrapped within narrative. So we created a book called Ghost Fleet that was a novel, but with 28 pages of research and notes. And every scene in it was designed not just for entertainment, but to let the reader understand a key issue. And it turned out really well. I mean, it sold, became a bestseller. But what was interesting is it actually drove more policy change than anything that I had worked on in my career prior. And I'd had a pretty good career. And the same for August. He'd had front page news stories in the Wall Street Journal. But for our book, for example, we got to brief the president about what he needed to know about AI, to 6 different testimonies to Congress, to talks everywhere from the tank inside the Pentagon to the Nobel Institute, including on some of the international law ramifications of the technologies we were looking at. But it wasn't just briefings, it changed policy. Everything from there were 3 government investigations launched to keep things that we talked about in our novel/narrative from ever coming true, to the Navy created a $3.6 billion ship program named after the book. And so from that experience, it led us to realize that one, narrative could be a very powerful tool in the real world if deployed strategically. And 2, a lot of other organizations out there have this problem of telling their story, so to speak. Complex issues that aren't connecting with audiences, or people are reading their work but not acting on the work. And so that's what useful fiction is. And circling back to our topic today, we've since done, as a business, over 60 different projects for organizations that range from NATO to US Special Operations Command to the British government to Fortune 100 companies. And a lot of them have touched on help us envision changes in the future of conflict and security. Both what do they mean, but also what are some of the legal, ethical dilemmas that aren't going to be fiction coming soon, and we need to make them real, so to speak, for us before they happen in the real world. Topics like AI, drones, quantum technology, you name it.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And, in some ways, it's not surprising that people are really interested in telling those kind of stories about the work that they do or the changes that are coming. But it's kind of amazing that you've been able to work with so many disparate groups and do it in a way that's really grounded, as you say, in research. And, I read Ghost Fleet, and it is the endnotes are real. And that kind of research-based fiction is pretty unusual. So anyway, with that, let's talk about what's happening now and kind of in the near future on the battlefield. There's so many topics here. You raised a number of them just now. But the ones that I feel that international lawyers seem to hear about the most or engage with the most include things like the role of AI, autonomous weaponry, drones. Of course, we see that extensively, and that's been a hot issue for international lawyers for a long time. But we see it in a different way in Ukraine specifically, but I'm sure elsewhere. So I guess maybe my first question is just: I listed those 3. What else would you include as being kind of the key frontier technologies that we're starting to already see, whether it's in the conflict in Gaza, in Ukraine, or elsewhere, that we should be aware of?
I think those are a good way of thinking about it, but let's put a broader categorization around it. So overall, I think we're seeing a rethink of the modern battlefield that's mirroring what's going on in the modern economy and society. If you go to sci-fi, people talk about the robot revolution, and I know there's been a lot of some university projects on existential threat from AI, but I think it's certainly in your and my lifetime a worry about, do we need to salute our metal masters? Instead of a robot revolts, it's the idea that we're going through something akin to an industrial revolution. And that, much like mechanization, a century back, it has effects on everything from where people work, how people work, but also how people fight, who fights, the ways that you might win, the ways that you might lose. There's, of course, major legal, ethical, political questions that come out of it. I mean, think about how the last industrial age, it led to positive legal and ideological issues like workers' rights, children's rights, women's rights, all come out of the last industrial revolution. Some scary stuff came out of it as well, fascism, communism, etc. And so we're seeing something on that level right now playing out around us. So that's the first overall. And then, as you know, it breaks down into a couple of areas. And I think of it really best categorized as software, hardware, and then the network side. So the software side is everything that's going on in AI. The hardware side is the physical robotics, including drones. And then the network side is what connects it all. And that's where we're seeing, changes in your and my use of the internet, but also ramifications for security. So the two big changes there is the move to the Internet of Things, which has altered the threat from cyber, where it's not just about stealing information, but causing physical damage. And then the other network side is something that we called in a book LikeWar, which is the information threat, that you're not merely trying to hack the network, but people on the network by driving information viral, all the issues of mis and disinformation, et cetera. So those are the overall categories. And then within them, you can see application to other fields that have these sort of game-changing effects. So there's a lot of incredible things. One area that you didn't mention that hasn't played out yet, but we're going to see more and more, is on the bio side, biosciences and bio threats. But that's really coming from the application of AI to that field, as an example. Or I referenced earlier quantum technology. That's on the computing side, but also how it's being applied to the network side in terms of quantum communication and what that means for encryption, et cetera. But that's a little bit further. If we're looking at what's happening in, the Ukraines, the Gazas of the world, it's really about those three areas: software, mostly AI; hardware, robotics; and then the network side, Internet of Things threats, and information warfare, social media borne threats.
Great. And just to clarify for the audience, Internet of Things is the idea that my refrigerator is internet enabled. All kinds of little devices are internet enabled, and that creates a sort of internet parallel to the one that we conventionally think about, and of course has all kinds of applications and risks associated with it.
Exactly. It's the idea, and you and I are unfortunately old enough, and I'm betting most of the listeners are, to remember, a short while back, the discourse related to the internet was, and its growth was, there's going to be hundreds of millions more people coming online and they'd get excited and say in the United States or in Africa or Latin America. We're past that. Most of what's coming online right now are not people, but things. Your smart thermostat, your smart refrigerator, your smart car. And it's not billions of people on the network. It's moving into trillions of things, using it not for communication, but operation. And it creates all these, wonderful goodness. It's great for the economy. It's one of the ways to reach more energy efficiency and deal with climate change. But it also changes the threat side because first, the attack surface grows. You're not just targeting billions of people, but trillions of objects. But secondly, you're not stealing information, stealing credit card information, or if it's international law and security, intellectual property, which is one of the concerns related to China and U.S.-China cybersecurity issues. Instead, you're affecting the actions of that network device. And basically, you can turn it into a weapon. You can shut down the operation of that, be it water system in a city or the electric car charging station. Or if you think about the concerns over ransomware, you wouldn't just be holding ransom the files at a hospital. You might hold ransom the medical systems that are operating themselves. And again, this sounds very sci-fi. We've already started to see the early examples of it. including in the war in Ukraine. The Russians have used this to go after certain Ukrainian energy systems and space systems. The flip side, some Ukrainian volunteer hackers went after electric car charging stations in Moscow, and they did what's called a defacement. They made the outside of the electric car charging station display a message that in Russian it said basically Putin is a dickhead, which is very mean but very true. But in addition to that sort of defacement, that vandalism on the communication side, they affected a system shutdown on the inside. So if you had an electric car, you couldn't fuel it up. You were out of luck. And it's a little bit of a taste of what's to come. So think of this little example and go, okay, what about in a war where the hackers were more organized, had bigger ambitions, more intelligence preparation? And that gives you an indicator of, where we're headed, where, say, like a US versus a China.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I guess one question on the cyber side, I have so many questions. I feel like we could spend 2 hours, which we're not going to do, but there's a ton here, and hopefully I can have you back at some future date. But just on cyber and what you described, you pointed out one thing, which is that you mentioned these Ukrainian kind of volunteer hackers, that oftentimes you have individuals or groups that are maybe loosely allied with a state, or maybe controlled by a state, but maybe not at all controlled by a state. And they're able to take down infrastructure in the way you just described. And that raises very interesting questions about retaliation, about attribution, and so forth. And as you say, we're already seeing some of that. But I guess one thing that I've noticed, and I know a couple of other people have noticed too, is with regard to Russia, Ukraine, you're talking about, two countries with a lot of capability in the cyber realm and long histories. And yet there doesn't seem to be a huge amount of cyber attack happening, or at least it's not breaking through in the news. Maybe it's happening and we don't know it. Is that your sense? And how do you sort of interpret that? Is it what you expected if we spun back the clock 3 years ago and said there's going to be a major war between these two countries? I think a lot of people would have predicted that cyber would play a big role. Is there anything unusual about what we're actually seeing now?
So what's interesting is I think it's because of a misconception that was pushed upon us somewhat by Hollywood, but also by a lot of people in the field who claimed it would be this single massive strike that would take all the power offline and it would end the war.
Cyber Pearl Harbor kind of story.
Cyber Pearl Harbor. And it's funny, we've literally been talking about Cyber Pearl Harbor for multiple decades, actually, from the time that it was first used and when it dated back to Pearl Harbor. It's now been longer. But the point is that it's not, so that didn't happen. But it's not that there isn't a huge amount of cyber conflict. It's a lot like, if this was World War II, and the same kind of thing was talked about with planes. The bomber will get through, it'll end the war. It'd be like looking at the Battle of Britain and saying, well, the Germans didn't defeat Britain using only planes. I guess planes don't matter. Every single day in Ukraine and Russia and around the world, there's a massive amount of cyber conflict back and forth. It's just not had the sort of oversold single hit war winning effect. And so, do not think that there's not a lot of cyber activity. There is a huge amount of it. One of the other things that's been come out of Ukraine is its integration with other domains of conflict, and that really points to the future. So you, as an example, might use cyber means to gather intelligence about a target. It might be by hacking the communications of Ukrainian officers, or it might be on the open source side, scraping something off social media. You then fire a drone at that target, but then you hack a radio or TV station simultaneously to broadcast out misinformation about the results of your drone strike. See how they're kind of all coming together in more of like a tactical way than this just single big strategic gonna end the whole war. So that, the cyber harbor are making comparisons to nuclear weapons. I think that's where people went a little bit astray with discourse related to cyber means. I want to hit another legal ethical thing that you raised about the who side of this. I think there's a thread that connects, what's gone on in Russia and Ukraine, and with, both the cyber operators, but also a lot of the people that are behind the drones, is that it's a connection back to, what we saw, the discourse related to insurgents, terrorists, private military contractors, more than a decade back. It was this issue of, well, they're not wearing a uniform. In some cases, they're not physically in the declared war zone, but they're very clearly active in the war. Oh, by the way, some of them may be criminal in form, but most of them have been brought in by one of the state combatants to that war. And, that's the thread that links back to the discussions over, drone strikes on terrorists in Pakistan, to, the debates over Guantanamo, to the link of the debates over the Blackwaters of the world and accountability for them, to, now Wagner Group on the Russian side, drone operators that are civilian in some cases on both the Ukrainian and the Russian side, cyber combatants, even that term maybe is not the right one for me to use. It's loaded, but people that are hacking, they're part of the war, but are they combatants or not? So there's a thread that connects to all of these. It's really about the Geneva Convention's 1945 view of the world isn't matched by what we're seeing in a lot of conflict today.
Yes. So that's all super interesting. Let's pick up on the drone issue you just mentioned. One of the things that's interesting about the war in Ukraine, and I want to talk about other conflicts as well as Ukraine, but just to stick with it for a second, it seems like the Ukrainians have been very innovative, and they're not the only ones in terms of using small drones. So, 10 years ago, the drone debate, certainly within the international law world that I live in, primarily was more about targeting questions and large drones and Reapers and things like that. And now instead you see these relatively small drones being used for all kinds of things, not just to, drop a very large missile down, but to do a number of different things, survey, suicide drones, et cetera. And they're totally different. At the same time, there's this trench warfare that, many people have likened to World War I. So there's this kind of move back in time and move forward in time. And I just was curious what you thought about these kind of drone swarms, and whether, I know this is a kind of meta issue, whether our traditional way of thinking about big weapons platforms is really now kind of archaic, and the future is going to be about these very small weapons, but issued out in huge numbers and maybe used in almost a disposable way. So, I just threw a number of things on the table, but I'm just curious to hear what you think about those topics and where they're going, and whether Ukraine really is a window on that change.
I think the international security and law community will be forced to look at the conflict in Ukraine as a historic parallel to the Spanish Civil War of the 1930s, where there's a lot of parallels in terms of standing up to authoritarianism, fascism, et cetera. But there's also the idea that wars are also akin to learning laboratories. And so if you go back to the 1930s, you had a series of technologies that had already been used in war, the airplane, the tank, the radio, but they were both becoming more advanced, but also being brought together in new war-winning ways. You had the Blitzkrieg taking shape in front of everyone's right there in the open, just for them to either learn the lesson as the Germans did or miss the lesson as the French did. But you also had all of these big legal ethical questions that emerged from that. So the Spanish Civil War, you had aerial bombing of cities, Guernica, that then led to, not just law questions, but even new forms of art. The very same things happening with AI. And so I think there's three big lessons that are emerging from the use of drones and AI in Ukraine. The first is there used to be a debate over whether they mattered, and if so, well, they matter just in these counterterrorism, counterinsurgency fights. But when it comes to the big wars, no, these are still toys. That military and academic debate is now over. They have obviously played a incredibly important role from the very start of the conflict to today in every single domain. They're part of the story of how, Russian tank forces are stopped to, they've been part of the story of sinking half of Russia's Black Sea fleet. And the key in this is not just them carrying out their own strikes, but pretty much all of the sighting for what we call fires, the artilleries, the missiles, comes from drones. So right now in Ukraine, a unit does not go out either without being either supported by drones or worrying that it's going to be detected by drones. It's also been part of these larger strikes on civilians within, and this question of, what's the combat zone, hitting civilian buildings in Kyiv to strikes into targets in Moscow. And so all of these, it takes us back to the old discussions about aerial bombing and the military strategy, but also the legal questions. Well, now it's happening, as you know, because of drones. The second, though, as you notice, is another change. It's not merely these big, expensive platforms that are remotely operated. It's a move to small and mini drone swarms that are cheaper, more disposable. And that's happening in the air, but it's also, again, happening at sea to even on the land. There was a battle in Ukraine a couple months ago where machine gun armed Russian ground robots were taken out by small armed Ukrainian drones. That leads to the third, which is, for a long period of time, the debate related to robotics and autonomy in both policy and law was the acronym was LAWS, Lethal Autonomous Weapon System. The narrative was killer robots. Oh my God, what if one day we combine autonomy and lethality? And there was everything from, massive, international law journal articles about it to multiple meetings at the UN. And it happened, and no one made much of a big deal of it. Ukraine deployed a system called Soccer Scout, which is it's a relatively small drone. How it's armed.
Small, like a person could carry it, or
it's not one of these, like a Predator drone was the size of a large, like a Cessna airplane. This is one that's like, I'm gonna maybe get it incorrect, but roughly, like, think of like the size of a desk. Okay. It doesn't have hundreds of kilometers of range. It doesn't carry multiple missiles. It carries several kilograms of explosives, but it's lethal. And the most important thing, though, is that it is designed to operate without human oversight. It is preloaded with the signature of approximately, if I remember the number, 62 Russian system targets, and then unleashed on the battlefield. If you find one of these, as you roam around, if you find something that has the signature of a tank or the signature of an artillery piece, do not report back to me, human. Do not ask for my permission. Take it out. And, then we get into this wonderful legal debate about, does that mean it's on the loop or in the loop? But the point is this was one of these what ifs. What if one day? And it happened without much fanfare after, all the discourse around it. And so that's been, that line was crossed. And I think, a little challenging for the United States by one of our allies. It had always been, well, what if, we respected this and other, the Russias and Chinas didn't. And again, to be very clear, Russia's falling in the same pathway. But my point is, it was complicated by it was one of our allies. And this connects to the same thing has happened related to the use of AI in Gaza, where Israel's been the one that's, taken it to new frontiers. And so that has complicated the discourse around it.
Yeah. No, that's all fascinating. And in fact, I was just going to ask you, we're speaking on September 12th, 2024. And just a couple of days ago, Human Rights Watch, issued a discussion and sort of condemnation of some of the uses of AI by Israel in the Gaza conflict. So maybe elaborate on that. I mean, it's, I guess, not surprising that there's going to be criticism of the way digital tools are being used on the battlefield. But others in the past have said, look, AI will be helpful, as boosters often say, AI will be helpful at doing things better than humans will do, discriminating between civilians and combatants and so forth. But that doesn't seem to be the case, according to Human Rights Watch, at least, and some other observers. So what's your take on how AI is being used and whether it is capable of being a force for good in a humanitarian sense on the battlefield?
So how Israel has reportedly used it is by applying AI to the intelligence collection and analysis problem as it relates to targeting, particularly with air and artillery strikes. So in the reporting, which was from 972 magazine, and then multiple IDF officers corroborated. Basically, they've applied a series of AI platforms, but two in particular stand out. One called the Hasbara, the Gospel. It pulls together data that's been gathered by everything from drones, so drone video feeds, to seismic data to identify building targets. And then there's a second related program called Lavender that essentially does the same thing for people targets. It pulls in, everything from your WhatsApp membership group to whether you used a cell phone near an explosion, and then applies to the population of Gaza a scoring basically that generates out your probability of being a Hamas member, a ranking from 0 to 99. The outcome of that is that, on one hand, Israeli sources report that, like any other use of AI applied to this sort of information problem, it's been able to sift through this information, find connections in a way that humans would find difficult, if not impossible. So they, for example, say that it generates out information for targets the equivalent to if they multiplied their team of human intelligence analysts by 50. That's 50. And as an example, it allowed them to strike roughly twice as many targets in the first couple months of the war after Hamas's just disgusting and horrendous attacks. The first couple months of the war, Israel struck roughly twice as many building targets as it had during the entirety of the prior war in Gaza. The same thing, able to, on the Lavender side, able to sift through all the information and identify, if I recall the number, it was 37,000 the Bashin identified members of Hamas. More information, faster information. The flip side, though, is that as in any use of AI, first, it's only as good as the data that goes into it, and the data that goes into it can be bad, and or you have to make judgments about that data. So, as an example, on the lavender side, someone who is in a WhatsApp group with another suspected Hamas member, someone who turns on their cell phone near an explosion, that seems a pretty good indicator, right, that they're a member of Hamas. On the other hand, it could be their relative is a member, or maybe they're a journalist or a humanitarian aid worker. That's why their cell phone is turning on near an explosion. Another issue is error. Again, not complete certainty. So there's always going to be error with AI. It's your question, and this goes to the human side, what level of error are you willing to tolerate? And at least according to the reporting, at one point in time, they were willing to tolerate a 10% error rate. So system, 10% of the time, if you're wrong, I'm okay with that. Another question is the settings that you put it on. So to your question of, can it help reduce civilian casualties? Well, one of the things that these systems can do is not just identify the target, but they can, for example, project the expected civilian casualties from using a certain kind of bomb or artillery strike against that target. Well, just like if you're, looking for hotels online, it will provide you the information based on the settings that you tell it. So, system, only send me 4-star hotels that are available these dates. You know what? Actually, I'm really desperate. Now send me 4 and 3-star hotels. And it's the same thing, at least reportedly, they, prior to the conflict, had different settings that they were of expected civilian casualties, and that it was the human decision was made, at least at one point, to put on the target list targets that had up to an expected 10 civilian casualties per target. These are all, and I'll end here just simply by saying, so we're seeing these incredible new uses of AI. Whether you see it for good or ill depends on the angle that you take on that debate. But for me, the key takeaway from the legal side is, even in the situations where the human is ostensibly in the loop, still making decisions, adding AI to it, it doesn't change human responsibility, either when they're directly making the decision or when they're making the decision off a list that the AI recommended for them. A human still programmed it, still said, I want these parameters. So I found a lot of the discourse on it has been sort of trying to place it onto AI as the problem, when it still comes back to human decisions.
Peter, this has been fascinating, and I hope that we can get you back on at some future date, because I think it's fair to say we only really scraped the surface of a lot of really interesting and really significant issues. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and I hope to see you again soon.
I appreciate you having me.